So much, Titi, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening. This is an important topic, so it's great to see so much interest in it. The situation in Syria, as exemplified by the recent battle in Aleppo, highlights the growing dysfunctionality of the United Nations system of collective security. The Assad regime, with their patrons, Russia and Iran, have breached virtually every norm of international human rights, international humanitarian law, or the laws of armed conflict, and international criminal law. And the emergence of ISIL on the scene in 2013 has added a new source of seemingly unrestrained violence. Indeed, virtually every war crime and crime against humanity known to humankind has been and is being committed within Syria, from the use of chemical weapons and other weapons that cause unnecessary suffering, to the deliberate targeting of the civilian population, to the breach of the inviolability of medical workers and media workers, and to custodial abuses and rampant sexual violence. Furthermore, the Commission of Inquiry that was formed by the United Nations, and which one of our guests represents, found the commission of genocide is ongoing in Syria with respect to certain minority religious populations. None of the international community's feeble efforts to date has really made a dent in the violence and has done anything to improve the situation on the ground for the people of Syria. And it was only until very recently that the international community has made a tangible commitment to bringing to justice those perpetrators who have committed these crimes. Russia has vetoed an effort to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. And so as of now, there is no international court with jurisdiction over the crimes in Syria. This now has not stopped members of civil society and other actors from working to promote justice for the people of Syria and to advance the cause. Indeed, as we will learn this evening, there are a number of dogged efforts to document international crimes and to lay the groundwork for future accountability. And as a result, what we're seeing now is sparks of justice in courts around the globe, including our own. The individuals who have joined us this evening have been central to these efforts to bring to justice perpetrators of the crimes in Syria and to promote the norm of accountability. To my immediate right is my friend and former boss, Ambassador Stephen J. Rapp, who served as the U.S. Ambassador at Large for war crimes issues under Secretaries Clinton and Kerry. He's also been chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which prosecuted war crimes committed in that country's civil war, and the chief of prosecution of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Next to him is Sarita Ashraf, who is the Stanford Law School inaugural global practitioner. She is the former senior legal analyst for the UN Commission of Inquiry, which was formed by the Geneva-based Human Rights Council, which is the chief human rights body of the United Nations. She's also worked in a number of tribunals, including the Special Court for Sierra Leone, on the defense side. And finally, we have Scott Gilmore, who heads the Washington, D.C. office of the Center for Justice and Accountability, which is a San Francisco-based human rights law firm. The Center for Justice and Accountability brings generally cases in domestic courts, but also represents victims before international tribunals. So I'd like to start, Sarita, if I could, with you. If you could give us a sort of 50,000-foot impression of the crimes that are being committed in Syria as documented by the Commission of Inquiry, and give us a sense of the significance of the battle for Aleppo.
So let me start this evening with a sense of the numbers that the war has brought forth. Syria is a country in which there are over 500,000 people are dead. 1 every 2 Syrians has been displaced from his or her home. 70% of Syrians, both internally displaced in their homes and outside of Syria, live in extreme poverty. And half of all Syrian children no longer go to school and are now being commonly referred to as a lost generation. The conflict has also sparked a refugee population which is fast approaching 5 million people living outside of their borders. The level in Aleppo, when Eastern Aleppo was finally taken in December, there were no functioning hospitals. The war itself has had particular impacts on women, children, other vulnerable groups such as the disabled and people with chronic illnesses. So what has given rise to this level of devastation of civilians and of civilian infrastructure? And that is an unrest which started in March 2011 and which became a non-international armed conflict in about February of 2012. So actually, I think it's almost about mid-February 2012. So today will mark the beginning of the 6th year of conflict, and certainly more since the unrest began. And it is a conflict which has been really characterized by, in some senses, deliberate attacks on civilians, and in relation to torture and forced disappearances, killings in detention centers, but also willful disregard for civilian life in terms of how the war is actually being fought on the battlefront, where it's being characterized by indiscriminate aerial bombardments by government and Russian forces and use of barrel bombs, unguided air-to-surface rockets, but also by indiscriminate shelling by armed groups. And of course, the conflict has metastasized into something which was really not seen when people took to the streets in March 2011, and that has brought forth what I would refer to as sub-conflicts. You have ISIS, obviously, in the north, taking up large parts of the north and east of Syria, their territory now shrinking under the bombardment and encroachment of Syrian Kurdish forces, but also conflicts between armed groups, and the rise of Jabhat Fateh al-Sham, which is the new incarnation of Nusra. So the Commission of Inquiry, where I worked for some time, 5 years, was set up in August 2011 by the Human Rights Council, and since then has been documenting violations of international law inside Syria. And what we've seen is, as I said, a battlefield and a behind-the-lines situation which is riddled with unlawful conduct and crimes against humanity, war crimes. And as President Shak mentioned, genocide in the case of the Yazidis in northern Syria, which is being carried out by ISIS.
Thank you. So, Ambassador Rapp, given this enormous crime base, could you map for us some of the documentation efforts that are happening in the civil society sector and some of the justice efforts that are happening in national courts around the globe?
And thank you for this program tonight. As someone that was involved in prosecuting Charles Taylor and prosecuting those responsible for the Rwandan genocide, and having worked in the U.S. government for 6 years, really trying to forward the global justice project, the effort to hold to account people committing massive crimes against civilians, Syria stands out as sort of an outrage against everything that we have fought for. Rules that have been, frankly, observed even in World War II in terms of the protection of humanitarian objects have been flouted, and for those looking at the global justice picture and who don't understand, and indeed it's hard to comprehend the sort of unfairness and the inequality and the lack of sort of horizontal equality between these situations. You have the worst crimes of the 21st century largely escaping, certainly completely escaping international judicial accountability, and efforts to move in that direction, such as the French resolution in May of 2014 to refer the matter to the ICC, blocked by Russia and China, and indeed almost anything, and even in the multilateral sanctions regime has been impossible to impose in the Syrian situation. So these crimes are happening in plain sight. They've displaced 12, 13 million people, some internally, a great many externally, all with profound effects on Europe and frankly on the rest of the world. And the judicial response to it is so lacking. It is a challenging thing for all of us to confront. Now, Sarita has described the work of the Commission of Inquiry established by the HRC. At the HRC, you can get a commission established with a majority vote. You don't have a veto by the United States, Russia, indeed the membership is 47 elected members from the General Assembly, and these investigations can go on. But again, in terms of doing anything to follow them up with justice, that's not possible. The approach that we certainly encouraged when I was in the administration, and really appreciate, frankly, the leadership of Secretary Clinton in pushing forward in the spring of 2012 even more robust efforts to document these crimes and understand the victims in Syria are profoundly interested in justice for their crimes, and we're coming out with, even at that stage, tens of thousands of videos of the suffering, made videos from cell phones, and And then, of course, also, as areas fell, sometimes to the opposition, only temporarily, there were opportunities to gain government documents. And something that the UN Commission of Inquiry wasn't equipped to handle. What are we going to do with these? And so there was an initiative from the United States to establish a Syrian Justice and Accountability Center that would work with Syrian groups to document these crimes, provide subgrants to other groups. One of the groups that provided to it became the Commission on International Justice and Accountability, that then obtained other funding, now has a budget of about $6 million a year and 135 employees, almost all of them from the region. And it has more than 700,000 pages of documents. At the same time, there have been other evidence coming out. One part of it that I've dealt with so intimately is the Caesar photos. This Syrian military police photographer who had spent his career doing forensic investigations if there was an accident or a jeep turning over or whatever, or an assassination, in his hospital where they did their investigations in the base not far from Assad's presidency or presidential mansion. Bodies start arriving by the hundred each day from the detention facilities in Damascus, and he's tasked, he and his team of 11, with taking pictures of them, creating essentially kind of phony files saying we've done some investigation. Doctor writes on them, died of cardiac arrest, which is indeed the way all of us will leave this life. It doesn't say how it killed us. And he begins to see people he knows. And he talks to extended family members saying, what can I do to defect? And they say, stay in there. And he stays in there for a year and a half. And finally, in August of 2013, when it looks like he's going to potentially become a torture victim himself and be taken in, it may have been found out, he smuggles 50,000 photos out. And we've never had evidence like this. I mean, pictures of the victims with cards on their chests that reveal the prison that they were killed in, identification within that prison, and the number of the victim, a numbering system that mounts to over 11,000. During the 16, 18 months that he's taking these photographs. Since that time, as he's come out and he's been provided with exile in a European country, it's been possible to identify some of these victims, and that may provide the opportunities for justice in third countries. I was involved with a group that began a case in Spain 2 weeks ago today, involving the victim sister, a victim who was tortured to death. Her husband was her brother was involved in grocery deliveries, but he was making deliveries potentially in opposition areas. He got picked up, and the next she knew is when the Caesar group was providing some of these pictures within the diaspora, and she found her beloved brother there. She's a Spanish citizen. She's a victim in the sense that and indeed, if you think about forced disappearances and people not knowing what happened to their family member, they are the victim of the kind of terror that the regime is committing. That provided jurisdiction in Spain, and based upon the investigation and all the other documentation that's been done, we delivered 3,600 pages to the Spanish judge on the 1st of February. We've charged in the complaint 9 officials, including in the prison where he was killed, the supervisors, and people up the chain. Of course, in international law, as everybody knows, under the arrest warrant case from the International Court of Justice, you can't charge the top guy in a national case, but you can get pretty close to the top guy. So anyway, we're hopeful the Spanish judge will, by the 1st of March, accept the case for jurisdiction and proceed. But that... And the case is an attractive one, to be frank, because the evidence is really solid evidence. So there are these ways potentially to get into court, though frustrating as it is to those of us that really believe that those that have committed these crimes should be facing accountability. We also have to recognize that in many conflicts, it's only when the conflict is over that we can actually get justice. But that's a small solace for the people that are suffering from these crimes. But at least the efforts of justice are beginning by virtue of this solid effort to document these crimes and to have the kind of evidence that sometimes we even lacked in the tribunal, which is evidence that focuses on the linkage between the horrible picture and those really responsible for the crimes.
Thank you. So, Scott, you and the Center for Justice and Accountability have recently filed suit against the sovereign state of Syria under the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act. Could you outline for us the legal framework that you're operating under, the nature of the case, and also how does that differ from the criminal cases like the one described in Spain that are happening in Europe?
Mm-hmm. So, I'd like to talk about some of the what and the how of the Marie Colvin case, but I also want to touch on the why, and both the why of why did it happen, why was she killed, and also why are we bringing this case. I'm going to start on that last point and sort of work my way back. The efforts that all the speakers tonight have underlined of documenting the abuses in Syria, I think, are the reflection of a really remarkable effort. The culmination of decades of international progress towards international justice. And I think often of a statement Henry Kissinger once said, which was that a fact-finding mission is the standard device diplomats choose when the desired outcome is inaction. And I submit that that's no longer the case. I think we've proven that that's no longer true because of the actions of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, because of the Commission for International Justice and Accountability. These documentation efforts, which are now being channeled into courts of law in the United States, in Europe, both civil and criminal, the evidence being proved is really a demonstration that sort of it's an if you build it, they will come theory of justice. And I think this sort of relates back to why, in my view, the attack on Marie Colvin happened, is because part of that infrastructure that's been developed, an infrastructure of accountability, international justice, humanitarian intervention or humanitarian responses, another key piece of that has been the media. And in many ways, the media is sort of the connective tissue in the international body politic. And the reason why international institutions in the first instance, or voters, democratic populations, people that ultimately decide how to respond to crises, the reason you know that the crisis is happening is because it's being reported on. Information is flowing out of it. And in Syria, that flow of information was one of the defining characteristics of the first year. And from our perspective, we think of the Syria conflict as this baroquely complicated, overlaid, multiple conflicts. It's hard to understand who's fighting whom and why. But it's very important to remember that in 2011, there was not a civil war in Syria. In 2011, there was a civil uprising of massive demonstrations, for the most part nonviolent demonstrations, and a brutal crackdown on those demonstrations, a violent response to these movements, generally calling for reform, an end to corruption, an end to inequality. And part of what allowed these demonstrations to flourish and spread throughout the Middle East as part of the Arab Spring, but certainly in Syria, were social networks and social media. And there were, by March 2012, estimates of more than 40,000 videos uploaded to YouTube from Syria, showing the demonstrations, showing the brutal crackdown on demonstrations. There were media centers, which were just sort of ad hoc groups of local activists that would get an internet connection and a laptop and would start collecting photos and videos shot on cell phones, upload them to the internet, and also start connecting to international news networks so that journalists could interview activists on the ground. But also eventually they developed an infrastructure of essentially smuggling in foreign journalists into Syria because the Assad regime had essentially put in place a media blackout. Right? There were no visas being issued for international journalists to come into the country. There were a few highly chaperoned official sort of junket tours of journalists that could come through. But if you were actually going to cover on the ground and report what's happening, you had to sneak in. And there was an incredibly courageous infrastructure of Syrian activists who were smuggling international journalists across the border, across the siege lines, and into areas like the city of Homs, which is Syria's third largest city, In late 2011, early 2012, Homs was really kind of people called it the capital of the revolution. It was where we really see the inflection point of civil unrest and a sort of a security crackdown morphing into rebels taking up arms and actually holding neighborhoods and forcing out the government forces. And the government forces laying siege to them, encircling them, shelling them indiscriminately with artillery, tank fire. The sort of starvation siege that is now so familiar in what we saw, in Aleppo. Homs was kind of the testing ground for that strategy. And there was a group of journalists who entered Homs. Marie Colvin was an American citizen, a reporter with the London Sunday Times, who was smuggled into Homs, smuggled into the neighborhood of Baba Amr across the siege lines. And on February 21st, 2012, after having been pinned in under artillery fire for days, Marie felt that there might be a chance that she was not going to escape and be able to file her story. And so she decided that night to go live on air while they still had an uplink to satellite, and go live on air to CNN, BBC, Channel 4, and report on what she was seeing, which was the indiscriminate shelling of civilians. Within hours after that broadcast, the media center, which was really just an apartment, residential apartment, they woke up the next morning, started preparing to go out to do another day of reporting when, boom, a loud crash happened outside the media center. Boom, another one came. Boom, another one came. One side, then to the other side, then to the other side, each time the shells falling closer and closer in what artillery observers call bracketing, which is a firing pattern of walking a shell onto a target when you can't see it because you're firing from a distance. So you have a forward observer say, drop 200, now drop 100, and now you've got it. And on the morning of February 22nd, 2012, a rocket landed right at the entrance of the apartment building while Marie and a French photographer, Remy Ochlik, were rushing out, and they were killed. The blast blew open the door and injured the Syrian media activist and several other journalists who were inside. And I remember when it happened, I was following Marie's stories. And at the Center for Justice and Accountability, we made a decision to investigate this because we recognized that there was a basis for jurisdiction in American law, which is the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. Normally, a foreign state is immune from the jurisdiction of our courts, but certain designated state sponsors of terrorism can be sued in a civil suit for the extrajudicial killing of an American citizen. And so what that meant was that we had the basis as of 2012, to bring a case in an American court. It would be very narrowly limited, however, to the killing of Marie Colvin as the only U.S. citizen in the attack. And I also want to say that in France, French law similarly allows the criminal and civil jurisdiction over war crimes committed against French citizens overseas. And so the French victims, the surviving French victim, came back to France, filed a complaint. France opened a criminal investigation. And these sort of parallel tracks have been now running since 2012 of investigating it. And the course of the investigation that CJA has conducted with the assistance of the Commission for International Justice and Accountability has essentially, we've now established, and the lawsuit that we filed last July is based on substantial evidence from insider witnesses who defected, from documents recovered from the regime that show that this was a deliberate targeting of the media center, that her broadcasts that night on CNN were being intercepted through satellite interception devices circling around the neighborhood, that there was a network of informants tracking their movements, and that this was part of a broader campaign all throughout 2011 and 2012 and beyond of systematically targeting media activists, journalists, anyone who was trying to sort of alter the regime's official narrative of the story, which was that this was sectarian terrorist groups doing violence. So the goal of the case for the survivors, for Marie's family, and of course for the Center for Justice and Accountability, is to use this one narrow, slender basis for jurisdiction to open a window onto the broader conflict. And it's just one case of many that will come, like the case just filed in Spain a few weeks ago. CJ is embarked on other investigations, and we expect to see more cases like this filed in national courts in the future.
Great, thank you. So, Sarita, as we mentioned, the Commission of Inquiry has been looking at the whole crime base within Syria and has produced a number of reports. I would recommend them to you. They're all available online. Some are more general and some have been more thematic. And you've recently worked on a report about genocide in Syria involving attacks by ISIL against religious minorities, and particularly the Yazidi, who were generally thought of as being in Iraq. So can you talk to us about the finding of genocide, what led you to that finding, and how the Syrian Commission had jurisdiction over, if we can say that, attacks against an Iraqi religious minority?
So on the 3rd of August 2014, ISIS fighters left bases inside Syria and inside Iraq and moved jointly to attack an area of northern Iraq about 15 kilometers at its nearest point from the Syrian border. And to attack this area called Sinjar, which is the homeland to the Yazidi religious minority group, which are Iraqi. And there are Yazidis in Syria, but they fled from ISIS before the ISIS advanced into their areas. The Yazidis, for those who don't know, are a small religious group. There are about 1 million of them in the entire world, and in that area there are about between 400 and 500,000 in the Sinjar region. They are reviled by ISIS because they are not people of the book. They are pre-Judaic. Their beliefs and practice span millennia. And they have a history of persecution throughout the region. They call this their 74th genocide, using the word genocide quite more colloquially than legally. But they have a history of being persecuted in the region on the basis of their religious beliefs. And that stems from a deep misunderstanding of what their beliefs are, an attempt to view their beliefs through the eyes of Christianity and Islam, and determining that they have aspects of their religion which involve worshipping the devil, which is not true, but is very widely held misconception of the Yazidis. ISIS, prior to its attack, sent out its so-called, what they would call religious scholars, I'm not sure what we would call them, to determine how the Yazidis should be treated. So it was no surprise that they decided to attack the Yazidis, and it was quite clear that although there was a military reason for taking that territory, the target of the attack was very, very clearly the Yazidis, because any military groups, the Peshmerga or the Kurdish Iraqi forces, had withdrawn largely before the ISIS advance, and therefore there were no real military targets in the area. ISIS had been very clear that the Yazidis did not have the right to exist within its so-called caliphate, and that they were going for what they would term a pure Islamic state in which there was no room for the Yazidis to exist. And the Yazidis, not being people of the book, don't fall within the categories of Christians and Jews, which, although they live extremely difficult and I would say persecuted lives within the Islamic State, it is possible to live as a Christian. A Jew, I don't know, because there are no Jews, but there are certainly small, very, very small, beleaguered communities of Christians living in ISIS-controlled areas of Syria and to a much lesser extent Iraq. For the Yazidis, that's simply not possible. So when ISIS went in, they immediately, Yazidis fled, some fled successfully, some fled up to Mount Sinjar in the region where they were besieged under 50 degrees Celsius temperatures. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit.
122.
122, without food or water. Hundreds of Yazidis died on the mountain, mainly children and the elderly, and were eventually rescued by Syrian forces. Some Yazidis weren't able to escape, and for those, ISIS went through what is actually, I think, quite common in genocides, of the separation of the men from the women, and the older boys from the women, killing, in many instances, the males, sometimes forcible conversions, although there's quite a lot of evidence now suggests that forcible conversion didn't hold, and they were then later executed in the spring of 2015. And then taking the women and girls apart and the younger boys. And as most people in this room will probably have heard, because there was quite a lot of media focus on it, those women were then taken off to holding sites and then sold into sexual slavery, where they are traded among ISIS fighters. And they are sold in slave markets, which I think has got the majority of the attention, but in fact they're more likely to be sold on an individual basis and sometimes online in closed encrypted groups using encrypted apps. The commission and also the children are taken, the young girls are also taken, and children are sold as a package with their mother until the girls are 9, when they're also sold off in sexual slavery, and boys age of 7 when they're taken to ISIS training camps. And in fact, a video came out couple of days ago, maybe yesterday or the day before, which I think was authenticated by one of the journalists from the New York Times who's been working on this for quite a long time, showing 2 Yazidi boys who had been indoctrinated by ISIS and then sent on a suicide mission inside Iraq. So the Yazidis, ISIS usually for crimes of genocide, it's usually quite difficult to see the intent. And the crime of genocide requires a special intent, which is the intent to destroy or in whole or in part. And often in cases like this, you can see the crimes against humanity. You can see that you might have the war crimes of enslavement and so on. For genocide, we had to go back and look at the particular intent. And that's usually quite difficult. But in the case of ISIS, in fact, it's a very low bar, because ISIS has been very public about what it's trying to do and why it's trying to do it. ISIS is not a group that has attempted, across any of its crimes, really to try and reframe its conduct or to hide its conduct by saying, for example, these are an opposition group and this is why they're being targeted. They've said very clearly that the Yazidis are a devil-worshipping sect, that they have done research as to how they should be treated, and this is what they're doing is correct in cleansing the area of this group. How the Commission became involved, just really briefly, is because in late August 2014, when 2 weeks after the attack, we hadn't looked at the attack itself because it occurred firmly inside Iraq and was being dealt with by other parts of the UN, including the UN mission in Iraq. But by September 2014, scarcely a month after the initial attack, we began to get statements from Syrians who were fleeing ISIS, but who were coming out of Syria into Turkey and so on, meeting with our investigators and describing what had happened to them, but then there would be a note in their statement about they had set up a slave market in the town, or they had heard something about these women being sold, or they could see fighters coming in, or there was an area they were no longer allowed to go to. And it became quite clear that within 2 weeks of the Sinjar attack occurring, convoys of Yazidi women and children were being taken into Syria, where boys were being trained at bases and women were being sold in slave markets in Raqqa, in Tadmor, in Homs, and in Al-Bab, and various locations around Aleppo. So at that stage, the Commission took it upon itself to become involved because it felt clearly within our mandate. And although there was a lot of documentation of what was happening in Iraq, there was almost no documentation of what was happening in Syria. And within that documentation, the Commission, because the expertise on the Commission was perhaps better situated than human rights units in UN missions, for example, to look at it and not look at the crime, but look at how do these crimes fit within a continuum of genocidal violence, rather than looking at each thing individually. How is each crime a building block towards a greater aim of the terrorist group as ISIS? So that was the Commission's contribution.
Ambassador Rapp, the International Criminal Court was designed to deal with situations like Syria, and yet, as you've mentioned, so far, its consideration of this situation has been foreclosed by the Russian veto. Is there a pathway that you can imagine by which the ICC could assert jurisdiction over the situation in Syria? And can you discuss with us this new initiative that's just come out of the General Assembly to create an investigatory mechanism of some sort? It's quite a novel proposal, and how do you envision that feeding into accountability efforts, and how does it distinguish from the Commission of Inquiry that's already been created by the Human Rights Council?
It'll be difficult for the ICC to become involved. Obviously, the best way would be through a Security Council referral, or eventually for a post-conflict Syrian state to join the ICC, or to send the case to the ICC, which a state who's not a state party can do, which has happened, for instance, with Côte d'Ivoire and with Ukraine. Obviously, Assad's not going to send it there. And to be frank, if there were a transition, certainly from the Syrians that I know, even though they would love to have the ICC involved today in order to be putting out arrest warrants and sending clear signals, I think if you did have a transition, then their desire would be to have a judicial system more based in Syria, or at least working with regional actors, a court that would be more at home in that particular territory. So I tend to think we won't see the ICC there. I should say, as a footnote, and it relates to the Yazidi case, and there were those hoping to get, even our friend Amal Clooney continues to work on this particular project with the group Yazda, hoping that because there are foreign fighters engaged in the crimes of Yazidis, amongst them, for instance, there was Abu Tanuzi, who was essentially the finance minister and was also enslaving Yazidi women. He was killed in an operation actually in May of 2015. He's Tunisian. So if you have a Tunisian, the ICC could prosecute a Tunisian because the ICC has jurisdiction over the nationals of the state party. He's gone. I've seen lists that the CIJA has done. We have an Australian, 2 or 3 Tunisians. There's some other people, but they're relatively low level. And the prosecutor, when confronted, Prosecutor Bensouda of the ICC said, why don't you take this on? On one hand, she would say, well, shouldn't Tunisia or Britain or Australia, they have jurisdiction to prosecute their own and to go after these cases under the principle of complementarity. And even if they were to send me the case, or 15 countries who had people there were to send me the case, I can't get al-Baghdadi, I can't get key leaders, and the ICC really needs to be involved in those at the highest level. Obviously, if we had a number of serious offenders at the highest level, it might be tempting to go in that particular route. But thus far, the people that really are pulling the strings, this Al-Tunisi, the late Tunisian is an exception, tend to come from Iraq and Syria and those areas. And the foreign fighters tend to be, I don't call them cannon fodder or suicide mission fodder, et cetera, but they're not so involved in the perpetration of these crimes. I do keep in mind that I do think, before I talk about this mechanism, that there is the potential for prosecutions, independent prosecutions of the ISIS actors that there isn't in the Syrian context. I know in the Kurdish region there's a great deal of interest in justice for the Yazidi. They see this as part of the way in which the whole Kurdish region has suffered, and they would like to have an international court or an internationalized court or even a mixed court established in that region that could try these cases and invite in other Arab judges, even judges from the West, to try these individuals. And we are now, with the slow but sure liberation of Iraqi and Kurdish territories, some of the perpetrators are being caught, and they are in prisoner camps, and they are high-level people. And the quick and easy solution to these cases, which we follow with terrorist organizations generally, is to prosecute them on material support to a terrorist organization, which is, what do you have to do? Show them their ISIS card, show them a picture of themselves out there with a few heads or something like that, and you've got the conviction. You don't have to prove anything. On the other hand, when people are convicted of those kind of crimes, it's because they fought for the Quran. It's because they fought for Allah, because they fought for the restoration of the caliphate, etc. They're martyrs. If, on the other hand, you prosecute them for raping and enslaving Yazidi women, this kind of mumbo-jumbo interpretation of why this is justified aside, that looks pretty awful. And I've talked to victims who describe being raped 3 in a bed with 12-year-old girls who didn't survive the rapes. And you see also ISIS engaged in vicious crimes against innocent civilians. And you see ISIS now actually trading in drugs, making major resources selling an amphetamine-like synthetic drug that they're manufacturing and moving. This doesn't sound very Islamic to me. And prosecuting them for their actual crimes as opposed to just being a member or a material supporter, I think is actually a good strategy when it comes to discouraging recruitment and everything else. And not even putting them to the death penalty, even though there's always strong pressure for that among victim groups, and it's certainly in that region, but not a martyr off to the 99 virgins, but locked up, treated humanely for the rest of their lives, I think is actually perhaps a more effective penalty. So I do think there's some possibility for justice in the areas. It's complicated because our past experience with Baghdad and the Saddam Hussein trial wasn't very good in terms of observance of human rights and the botched executions and everything else. So there were some good judgments there. And the Iraqi government wants to win the war before they have justice. And if you're doing it in the Kurdish region, you have to be delicate in not sort of declaring Kurdish independence, which the Kurds deserve, but would be profoundly destabilizing to the region. And so all the international actors oppose. So there are some challenges of getting this done. But anyway, there's some hope on that front, at least for trials. But back to the broader issue of Syrian accountability, and understand when we talk about Syria, and we were talking about Aleppo tonight, and we're talking about the crimes that began with them taking those children who wrote the pro-democracy slogans into custody and torturing them to death. It's even in the Caesar photos, because he got a broader group of photos from the security services of the kids, of one of those kids, horribly tortured. In fact, his private parts were amputated brutally. It was returned to his parents. That's what the regime was doing at the beginning of this. And then when the parents took to the streets, they shot them down. And Assad gave a speech about these are all seditionists. We've got to destroy this. And so they brought this on, and they've destroyed all of the sort of tried to destroy every kind of middle group that would make that society resilient. And have continued to carry on the most bloody-minded targeting of civilians sort of strategy you can imagine. And to the extent that anybody could believe that this guy is going to be sort of a useful ally against ISIS, the guy that sort of empowered and created ISIS, is crazy. We hear these arguments occasionally from people. It's not true. No, that sort of approach with the extremists creates extremists. And to be frank, people in the prisons tell you that many times he'd give amnesties to the jihadists and let them go, so that the world would face the choice of the devil and the deep blue sea, and the people in the middle would be destroyed. So, I'm passionately committed to accountability for this government and its leadership and others that have engaged in mass atrocities on their own people. And getting there is challenging. And of course, as I said, the UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council is blocked. We have the Commission of Inquiry, which has been doing these great narrative reports and interviewed probably you're up to about 6,000 witnesses now, I think. Because of the UN and the capacities, they're not into the collection of the hundreds of thousands of documents. Others have done that. And of course, there are civil society and victims groups that also have access to evidence. What do you do about this? And how do you make it into criminal cases? And I talked about the Spanish case, and Scott's talked about the Colvin case. Those cases take a lot of work. And I'm glad the Spanish prosecutors are real interested in this, and there are war crimes units in European countries, though their record has, and I've worked with them on Rwandan cases and other things, has generally tended to take relatively low-level actors that are found there and prosecute them, and often on sort of direct perpetration evidence, trying to keep simple the cases, because of course if you're going to try a case in another country, you need witnesses from the home area. You've got a different language, you have a different culture, you have all of these sort of complex political things that could easily confuse the triers of fact. I've seen challenge cases that have been won. I've seen cases that have been lost because of that. So how do you really help that happen? Well, on December 21st, 2016, and not quite 3 months ago, in remarkable leadership, the U.S. wasn't, frankly, involved in the leadership. We came along and supported it. I wasn't in government at the time. If we had been, we would have been in the leadership of it, I think. But in any case, the Liechtenstein, our friend Christian Veneweser, and the Qataris led the charge to create an impartial, international, independent mechanism for Syria that would pull together the evidence, the broad background and testimonial evidence from the Commission of Inquiry, the documentary evidence from groups like Commission for International Justice and Accountability that have 700,000 pages of documents and lots of witness statements and a register of 1 million names of people that have been identified in the Syrian conflict, other groups, and put that evidence together, vet it, determine, if it's video evidence, whether it's been tampered with, examine the metadata, have the right expertise for that, determine whether there's been an adequate chain of custody on other information, such as that you can trust and believe that it's reliable and genuine, and do that, and then with the additional benefit of it being a multilateral global institution that's supported not by people who've had political views on this issue, develop files and then work with national prosecutors and others to provide information that would give people a real head start on prosecutions. Of course, this would be of enormous value if an ICC or if a mixed or hybrid court in Syria eventually had jurisdiction. But in the short run, it can, I think, increase the possibilities that we're going to have justice. Scott quoted "Field of Dreams" from my home state of Iowa. If you build it, they will come. But I mean, there is some truth to it. I know one of the biggest successes in international justice, and I know my friend Reed Brody was here last week, was the Habre case in Senegal. A lot of things happened. Biggest was, of course, the tireless struggle of the victims. But one of the most important things, as I'm sure Reed told you, was the discovery of very solid evidence by Human Rights Watch in 2000. It had earlier been uncovered actually in a National Truth Commission that nobody paid a whole lot of attention to. The report was kind of lost, and all of this material was kept in the former headquarters of the security services, the so-called DDS, that had been the piscine, the swimming pool, that had been turned into dungeons by Habre. Reed found it there in 2000. It included, documents, reports back from the prisons about some of the 40,000 people that Habre imprisoned. And in his own hand, he's writing on it, no one should get out of this prison alive. And so, boy, I'd love to have had that kind of evidence in Rwanda. Robert Jackson would have liked to have had it at Nuremberg, to be frank. That kind of evidence in the hands of the victims, then working eventually in building up the support of states, and we brought the U.S. on side on this case in 2010, even though the U.S. had supported Habre back in the 1980s, as said the French, because he was fighting Gaddafi's proxy. But all of that put together, Senegal initially was supposed to do it. They found reasons not to. Belgium got it, and Belgium has been told by everybody, don't do so many of these cases. They look at it and say, my goodness, this is a good one, mon Dieu. C'est un bon cas. Anyway, and they took Senegal to the World Court, International Court of Justice, to get an order. Look, if you don't want to do it, we want to do it. Prosecute or extradite. And they got that order, and there was a political change in Senegal because the president seemed to be protective of his friends, et cetera, in a country that respected the rule of law, and lo and behold, you have a trial. But the key was evidence. If you got it, there's, I think, an opportunity that to build a case, to find the jurisdiction. And, of course, a key part of this is sending the signal to those that are committing the crimes that they're not going to get away with it. Most of them obviously think they can. But as we work these things forward, we can, I think, begin to catch up with and counter the profound accountability deficit that the world has seen in Syria.
Okay, so maybe one more question, then I'd like to open it to the audience, and I'd address this one to Scott. Scott, the Center for Justice and Accountability does support criminal prosecutions, including working with our own Department of Justice and their Human Rights and Special Prosecutions Unit, but working in Spain, et cetera. But my sense is the bulk of the cases are civil cases, and that requires a plaintiff who's willing to come forward and say, j'accuse, I accuse, and be on a complaint and be a witness and call out the abuses that they've suffered. In your experience, what does it take for a witness or a victim to come forward like that and to take that sort of courageous step to seek justice?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of the victims that come forward to initiate filing a complaint are doing it very often not so much for themselves, but doing it out of a sense of obligation almost. A lot of people that have survived mass violence, situations of trauma, and we've all sort of heard the phenomenon of survivor's guilt. It can be a sense of like a responsibility, a duty to take action. And I think so a lot of times people that become plaintiffs in these cases are doing it so that thousands can speak through them. And that's quite an incredible undertaking, and it can be incredibly traumatic, but for some also therapeutic. And there is, in our experience at CJA over the years, we've had many clients who describe the experience of finally bringing a case into a court of law as this moment of sort of restoring order to the world, restoring a sense of justice, restoring the idea that there could be a civic institution that takes evidence, and will establish the truth of things and attach consequences to that, which is the exact opposite of the situation of living under a human rights abusing regime or living in an armed conflict where every principle of humanity is flouted. So I think for a lot of the victims, that's sort of one of the main motivations is it's a way of getting a bit of healing. For Marie Colvin's family, one of their motivations was understanding that two things. One, filing a lawsuit against the Assad regime was a way of continuing Marie's work. I mean, Marie died hours after making the powerful statement that the Syrian regime was slaughtering civilians with merciless disregard. And her sister, her mother, her niece wanted to continue to tell that story that Marie was telling, to continue exposing those crimes, and they had a platform that at that point no Syrian really had, which was to be able to file a complaint in a federal court in the United States and petition that court for a judgment, for a finding of responsibility, a finding that international law was violated and that consequences would attach. And so for them, it was also very important to recognize that that was a privilege that American law restricted to American citizens, and that thousands of Syrians don't have that access to justice. And so I think they felt very much compelled to do this case, to continue Marie's work, but also as an expression of solidarity for the thousands of Syrian victims and as a step towards this ongoing process of accountability, which I think we all know is very likely to take a very long time. And I can say from the perspective of 2012, 2013, when I was really starting to embark on this investigation, many of us had the sense that there's imminently going to be a fall of the regime and a political transition, opening up the possibility for transitional justice in country, in Syria. And of course, the geopolitics of it have changed very much so. I mean, it became apparent in 2012 and definitely in 2013 that Iran was backing the regime, that Hezbollah, Iran's main proxy, was increasingly stepping in, not just as sort of technical advisors, but as fighting forces on the ground. And then, of course, in September 2015, you had the Russian aerial intervention and that Russian bombing campaign at a point where, I mean, really, the Assad regime was sort of on the ropes. And I think that really has reframed this whole question. One, that it looks very much like Assad may stay in power. And two, there is such a complexity of the sort of proxy wars, these overlapping proxy wars within Syria and to some extent within Iraq, that it really sort of questions how, with so many different geopolitical powers at stake and implicated in some of the atrocities happening in Syria at this point, can the international justice systems actually hold those states to account? I mean, can you address a situation in Syria if you inevitably are going to have to look at the battle for Aleppo? You have to look at the Russian aerial campaign. You have to look at attacks on aid convoys and hospitals. And who is going to drag Russia into, never mind the ICC, but into their national court? And I think that is just, it's the fundamental challenge that we're facing. And so I think, the model that the sort of optimistic justice model that we were looking at in 2013 of saying, maybe in a few years we're actually going to have domestic prosecutions in Syria. Now it's almost, I would say that there are sort of two, models that we're looking at. One of them is a very Syrian model, which I would call the Hama model, because in 1982 there was the Hama massacre, which is one of the sort of the defining, atrocities under Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, a crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood and other opposition forces against the Assad regime, really went into the city of Hama and with practically, very little witnesses, and there's, very little historical record around it because there's never been an accounting, slaughtered thousands of people. And just recently, Jamil Hassan, who's the head of the Syrian Air Force Intelligence Directorate, which is considered one of the nastiest of the 4 intelligence agencies in Syria, a real hardliner, Jamil Hassan, who was sort of disappeared from public view for a long time, for a while it was actually rumored that he was dead. Well, he came out, felt emboldened enough to say that if only Assad had used the Hama model in the early months in 2011 and slaughtered thousands in those first months, we never would have had this war. And I think that's the Hama model, is if these crimes go unpunished and there is no accountability, then it encourages their recurrence. And so I think the prospect that we're facing now of Russian impasse in the Security Council, the possibility of Assad staying in power, I pray that that doesn't mean that, 20 years from now someone is citing the Aleppo model as a way for dealing with, mass democratic movements.
Thank you. So I'd like to invite members of the audience, please come to the microphone. We are recording this event. And I think what we'll do is take 3 questions and then allow the panel to answer. And then if we have time, we'll do another round and then have some closing remarks. So feel free. And if it's helpful for context, you can introduce yourself as well.
Hi. Thank you guys very much. My question is for Scott. If you could talk about, in the CJA case, specifically what's the relief that you're seeking in the suit? And I'm also curious if you can talk about, presumably nobody appears for the Assad government in response to the complaint. And I would assume that that's not atypical for CJA suits, perhaps. What's that like in court, and how does the case proceed without a defense?
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Wait, before we... Okay, why don't we go ahead and answer that, and then maybe people will formulate a question.
Okay. So this is a civil suit. So it's a suit for money damages is the relief sought, as well as entrance of a judgment. And in many ways, while under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act there is a mechanism to attach, enforce a judgment against assets of a foreign state if those assets are sort of within U.S. jurisdiction. And there have been cases successfully, where you've obtained a judgment and then enforced that judgment. That mechanism exists on paper. In practice, it's exceedingly difficult to actually enforce one of these judgments. And the reality of the case is that it's really not the motivating factor. I think the prime motivating factor is to start establishing a historical record of truth and to have an airing and a testing of the evidence of these crimes, and an adjudication in a court of law, producing a written judgment that sort of is this sort of definitive account of what happened based on the evidence. That's really sort of the prime goal, because of the sort of beneficial knock-on effects that can have. I mean, in our experience, CJA's experience, civil suits that we've filed have cross-pollinated to trigger criminal investigations and even prosecutions in the home country. They've triggered perpetrators being found when they've sought refuge in some third country and them being deported to be tried back in their home country, sometimes decades after the time when the crime occurred. And so that's sort of the long view of, in a sense, the relief sought is the relief of having a court weigh the evidence, enter the judgment, and catalyze that process of sort of reckoning. And the second question was... What do we do when no one appears? Yes, a default. So I should say that that there is a very long process under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act for service of process. For the law students in the room, civil procedural mechanism, quite difficult if you're suing a foreign sovereign. The statute actually provides specific mechanisms for attempting to serve them by mail to the foreign ministry in Damascus. Syria has a pattern of refusing to sign the package, and a signed receipt is the sort of proof of service that you need. And so there is a mechanism by which service can be effected through a diplomatic note. So we're currently in the sort of diplomatic process of having the papers of the lawsuit served on the Syrian Foreign Ministry through diplomatic communications. Now, they have the choice still of answering the complaint, coming in and defending the court, and they would hire a lawyer. And they have in previous cases. They don't always do it. There's some FSA cases that they just don't appear and they default. But sometimes they do. So one option for them is to defend. A second option is that we, as required by the statute, made them an offer to arbitrate these claims for war crimes under international rules of arbitration. And we proposed an arbitration in The Hague before the Permanent Court of Arbitration, with the supposition being that, if Syria is a legitimate player, it does as states do and engage in international systems, this is the conventional way for resolving international disputes. Let's take it to an arbitral panel in The Hague. So that's another option that they could choose to accept arbitration. And the third option is to simply ignore it. If that's the case, then they would default. The FSA provides a particular protection, a slightly elevated protection for foreign sovereigns. The same protection actually given the U.S. government against a default judgment is that the plaintiff still needs to establish their case to the satisfaction of the court. And so if you're suing an individual defendant, if they default on the case, then essentially liability is decided in the plaintiff's favor. And you might still prove up the question of damages, which would go to sort of the judgment entered. But in the FSIA case, and this is really what we want, is that even if Syria defaults, we will make an evidentiary showing. So the witness testimony, the documents, the imagery, videos, recordings, all of that, we're going to submit it into the record of evidence, and it will go public.
So maybe a related question. Ambassador Rapp, you mentioned the International Court of Justice and the suit that was initiated against Senegal for failing to move forward on a Habré prosecution, and Belgium steps in and says, we're willing to take him, you're under an obligation, either prosecute or extradite. Are there prospects for a civil suit against Syria before the International Court of Justice? There are a number of treaties that say that disputes arising out of the interpretation or application of this treaty shall be resolved before the ICJ. And so the Genocide Convention has that language. The Torture Convention has that language. What would it take for a case to go forward against Syria, like the FSIA case, but before the World Court?
And Sarita may need to speak to it, but there was some interest in this, and there continues to be. Many of us who want rapid action, I wish it had been maybe done 3 or 4 years ago, because obviously the International Court of Justice is not a speedy institution. I think the first response is due in a year, for instance, and I think a reply is due in 6 months.
Only the litigators in the room had that much time, right?
Yeah, indeed. So it is slow. Now you can seek provisional measures, but I don't think this would fit under that. But fundamentally, what you need for a proper case, and as I understand it, Syria is in the CAT Convention, and so you could, a la the situation with Senegal and Belgium, there could be a lawsuit by another state. Now, of course, Belgium had a reason. It had a prosecution that was active. It was seeking the extradition of Habré. Another state isn't quite in that same position, but obviously if there were a willing state, Canada or someone, they're willing to go forward with, that would be the best approach. Short of that, there's the way in which the General Assembly can ask for an advisory opinion, something that occurred on Kosovo independence, for instance. But that, of course, requires a political effort, not impossible given what we've seen in the General Assembly, unlike on some other issues. A lot of Global South actors, and particularly from the Arab world, are quite interested in Syria accountability. And so you can, I think, and traditionally been able to get strong resolutions out of the UN General Assembly, as we did this 105 to 15, though that would imply about 70 people who abstained or didn't vote. But it's possible, I suppose, but an advisory opinion, that, and $3.50 gets you a cappuccino at Starbucks. I mean, it's not exactly a firm and fast thing, and it wouldn't come for 2 or 3 years. And so, it's an option. We like law and judgments and a chance to lay these things out. So obviously, if there were a willing state, I think it would be. It'd be well worth doing. I think that the better approach still is to reinforce efforts for states to prosecute. And keep in mind, in both the Colvin case, which can be a criminal case in France, could frankly be a criminal case in the United States, because Colvin was a citizen. We don't do a lot of those, but certainly, and if an American is kidnapped in Colombia by the FARC and you come back here and you're able to extradite somebody, we'll prosecute somebody who commits a crime against an American. and we should be willing to prosecute those that are committed a crime against Colvin. On the other hand, prosecutors, and having been a U.S. attorney, I mean, it's fun to prosecute high-level people, but it's particularly good to get them in custody. Right. And the people that are really implicated in the Colvin case, not that there can't be some people that have come out that were involved in harms at a relatively low level, but you're talking about the people you cited in a very interesting it's on the CJA website, complaint which has very high-level people in it, people like Maher Assad, the president's brother, who's the head of the 4th Division of the Army and really in charge of these efforts in the suppression of harms. Ali Mamlouk, who's cited in all sorts of things as a top-level person in the intelligence hierarchy, really the leader of the National Security Bureau. Those people are named, and they could be prosecuted in France or in the United States. They don't have any immunity. They're not chiefs of state or something like that, and so you go after them, but you'd still have to get them in custody. The cases that European prosecutors, the cases that American prosecutors are more interested in, are the people that are in your country. And the reason that we have European war crimes units, and for a dozen years we had a European network. I helped set it up back in 2003 because they wanted to work on Rwandan cases. A lot of people involved in the Rwandan genocide, victims, survivors, had come to Europe, and also some perpetrators had come to Europe, and the victims were pointing these people out. And on one hand, the governments could go ahead and go through proceedings to revoke these people's asylum status or refugee status. Of course, if you're a war criminal, if you're a genocidaire under 1F of the Refugee Convention, you're not entitled to the benefits, and you could be sent back. But then that would, at least until Rwanda improved its justice system, there was the question, would they get a fair trial at home, et cetera. So, and that's often a situation when you talk about people that have come out of conflict zones who may have been torturers, but there's another bunch of people in that may not be following human rights. So the idea was we're going to prosecute these people and lock them up and send the signal that we're not going to be a safe haven for war criminals. And it largely followed from people that were identified through investigations of false claims to citizenship, or to refugee status. That's the kind of cases the U.S. does now to a substantial extent. And we have cases against Rwandans, Guatemalans, others. Even the Montano case, very famous case that's pursued by CJA, guy who was a vice minister of El Salvador, a defense minister, allegedly involved in the killing of Spanish Jesuit priests. That case was pursued in the United States for his false claim to citizenship. False claim. I mean, when I say false claim, when you do this, somewhere in the papers you're saying, I never committed a war crime, I never committed genocide. You may also answer a number of other questions in an immigration interview in which you deny being a follower of Roberto d'Aubuisson or, certain movements or anything. So there's sometimes abundant lies in these forms. You prove the lie. You can potentially send them to jail. 5 years for every lie, and usually you don't send people to jail just for a lie on a form, but because of the related conduct, they get some prison sentence. So we do that in the U.S. We don't generally have jurisdiction to prosecute people who committed the crimes elsewhere and are present in the U.S., but in most European countries they do, and so they prosecute war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity in their national systems. And those are the cases that are now coming up often with people from Daesh or ISIS as foreign fighters, but increasingly people who are perpetrators in the Syrian regime, particularly if they're in areas where the regime has lost power, at least for a part of the time. Those guys don't really feel that welcome down in Damascus. They end up joining the refugee flow. And so some of those people are in Europe and have been identified. And so we'll see those prosecutions. But the key is that they not be just the equivalent of the camp guard, that you really do make a concentrated effort to go after the most senior perpetrators. Now, is that useful? I think it is, because as you discover, even when you begin to explore who the families are of top leaders, you discover they have families, in-laws, that are living in London, living in other places, and enjoying their lives, and maybe spending some of the ill-gotten gain. They'd like to go visit them. They'd like to go visit their money, and their goods. Won't be able to. Et cetera. And to the extent that the people are engaged in a sort of heads we win, we maintain power, but tails we don't lose, we get to take our money and go elsewhere. This helps, I think, destroy the perception that that's out there. So those are the cases that I see coming on in a bigger way, and particularly being assisted by this Syrian mechanism.
Right.
I can say just very, very quickly, and Syria is a party to the Convention Against Torture, and the Convention Against Torture, Article 30, gives a route to the ICJ for disputes under that convention. Now, states can put in a reservation to cut off that route, and Syria has not done so. It has 2 reservations to that convention, but it hasn't made the Article 32 reservation. So that path remains actually very clear and open. Why it hasn't been done until now, I think, is less the question of what's legally possible and rather a question of what is politically welcomed. And there are reasons why states don't want a practice of bringing other states before the International Court of Justice in respect of custodial torture, and I think America is probably one of those that would perhaps be less keen on setting that precedent, but so we'll see.
Jessie?
Hi, I'm Jessie Brenner. I'm program manager at the Honda Center. My question, I guess, could be for anyone, but Ambassador Rapp, you really emphasized the point about hard evidence. And I'm wondering, with all of these technological advancements that we've made in, say, open source investigation, I have questions around sort of how open courts have been generally to these pretty new forms of evidence that we're gleaning, from computers here in Silicon Valley, looking at, geolocating and tagging images and videos that people are watching on YouTube. So I'm just curious, how various court systems have looked at that evidence in terms of admissibility.
And so far, we've had cases based upon videos in Sweden, for instance, which has had Syria cases, and frankly, video evidence, when it's done right, has metadata with it. If it's been altered, that's detectable. I think it's impossible to keep it from being detected because you'll have images that are taken at different times, and that will appear. And so I think it is potentially useful in cases. Now, of course, the video evidence often shows the crime base. It doesn't necessarily show the perpetration, though. If it, we always say, even though it's very dangerous and you don't want to encourage people to do it, but instead of taking a picture of the gory victim, you might, sweep around and do a 360 in terms of where the shells may be coming from. And a lot of advice is provided to groups about other ways in which at least information that's useful for linkage can be found. But I do think it's potentially there. One, not to get into a tangent, though it does involve the region, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, if you follow the litigation there, and people are not following it because it's an in absentia trial against various Hezbollah individuals, one of whom died and is no longer in absentia. He's truly in absentia from the world, not just from the court in the Hague. But that case has relied on the cell phone networks and on the UN III Commission that was established early on that managed to get all of the cell phone communications records from the companies that were operating in Lebanon in February, March or so of 2005 when this happened. And through massive efforts, and understand those cell phone records don't contain the content of the conversation like blow off the bomb now, but they were able to reveal that there were networks of cell phones that were only used around these bombings, and that it was then possible to co-locate those cell phones in the pockets of individuals who were carrying other cell phones, who were making doctor's appointments for their wives and things like that, and then go to the clinics and find out who called and things like that, and eventually put together these networks And right now, the expert witness has been on the stand for weeks in The Hague as the defense is trying to make something of this. And of course, those associated with the perpetrators and their allies are saying, "Oh, Mossad just fiddled with all the codes. We know they can do that." And so, no, it's impossible. I mean, these are sextillion lines of variability, et cetera, to develop this kind of record. So we'll see how the judges, and even though it's in an absentia trial, it's being ably defended by international lawyers who are every bit as difficult in that case as if they had real defendants. And indeed, they never stipulate to anything because they say, well, our defendant's not around. We can't ask for a stipulation. So actually, it's more difficult than a real trial, which is too bad. It'd be great to have them in custody and really be trying these individuals. But it does rely on this kind of network analysis. Those that have said that the court should do some other cases, some more modern cases, have to deal with the fact that when the International Commission that was dealing with Hariri announced, or when it came out that they had this material, Hezbollah ceased using cell phones for their communication. So it really is, if not quite a one-off, it relates to this period of 2005. And whether something can be so circumstantial in terms of the network that you can put people in it. But having seen it, as it's related to I think in the end it's a pretty good case, and to some extent having had difficulty sometimes with witnesses whose testimony would indicate that the sun had come up in the west or something. It is nice having technical information and not being relying on feeble and easy to confuse human memory.
Question? Erica?
I had a question related to the earlier question about the Hambre Tribunal and how feasible it would be to replicate that sort of like quasi-international limited jurisdiction tribunal in the case of Syria that did have relative success in Hambre's case, and what the main challenges would be to replicate that sort of tribunal in a case like Syria.
I mean, I don't want to dominate the answers, but having been involved in this, I mean, keep in mind the main thing we had in Hambre is Habre. He was in Senegal. Senegal had arguably jurisdiction over him. There were issues about whether their law could be retroactively applied to him, and that eventually led to the idea that the court had to be internationalized. But we didn't have problems with the access to the defendant. And so, and the idea was that then he should be fairly tried. To be frank, the international presence in it, I mean, there was clearly going to have to be international funding for it. But the international presence was largely a desire to create a tribunal that could enforce the law retroactively. Chief of state wasn't even an issue because Chad had waived it, et cetera, but that was the reason for it. Now, if you did have a particular serious perpetrator who was in a country, or a number of them that were in Turkey or someplace else, and they said, we don't have the capacity to try this, and people thought, their justice system might look like it was politically motivated because of their role in the events. Bringing in internationals in that context could make sense. This is a little related to the idea that was suggested at one time that the courts in the countries in the region could essentially grant their jurisdiction over these cases to an internationalized court. That ran into a lot of objections with states who saw their neighbors doing the same thing to them and thinking this wasn't such a good idea. But they, indeed, thinking creatively about ways in which you can improve and make justice more impartial in places where you do have access to defendants or where you do have solid jurisdiction is certainly a possibility, but getting the sort of financial support and everything for it, I think, is challenging. And the question of how significant it would be and how much more important it would be than just the third country of doing a fair process, having it internationalized, when it doesn't get you any more defendants, it just gets the ones that are there, I think, makes the idea not one that people are ready to jump onto.
Okay, I think final question.
I'd like to try to understand the sort of origins of this, whether sectarianism, it's very strong now. But at the time of Hafez al-Assad, the Hama massacre there was certainly sectarianism there. I don't know whether it was dominant or just a partial thing. But then with the American invasion of Iraq next door, that changed sectarian balance there. And I don't know how much of that encouraged Bashar al-Assad to not give in, or would be interesting to find out if anyone has.
Yeah, it's a very no real short answer to that question. So I'm going to try to be very short because I think one other person just wants to ask a question. I would say, actually, I think when people think about the Syrian conflict as springing from the roots of sectarianism, it's something that's much more convenient as a prism that they use to understand it. I don't think the roots of the Syrian conflict are at all, and I should say conflict, the unrest, which then turned into conflict, are in any way sectarian. I think there was a tinderbox that was created by a number of different factors, within them economic equality, within the community. Climate change was actually a huge factor in Syria. You had a drought which swept across the rural areas of the country. Farmlands dried up. It became impossible for young men to earn a living. They began to migrate to the cities. So on the eve of the unrest, you had large populations of, fairly young men who were unemployed or underemployed, for whom the economic inequalities had become so much greater. And then as the conflict unfolded, and then once people came onto the streets, and you should remember the conflict started with essentially very young 13, 14-year-old boys, one of them Hamza, who was killed and mutilated, writing pro-democracy slogans on walls, which didn't have any sectarian really dimension to it. And it was only when these children were tortured and some of them killed that people then began to rise up for a history of violation against the civilian population, which was linked to power sharing. And as the conflict unfolded, it began to take on more sectarian elements. But even those sectarian elements, I feel, were egged on by, in large part, the government by releasing people who had particularly sectarian views in its prison system out into the general population, who then began to form rebel groups which capitalized on sectarianism. And ISIS certainly has a very sectarian bent, but ISIS is not a Syrian organization. ISIS is really an organization that migrated over from ISI in Iraq into Syria and has really sat on top of the Syrian civilian population without any really seriously high-level Syrian commanders in ISIS. And so ISIS does foment sectarianism, but it's not something that arises from the original conflict between armed groups and not even armed groups, civilians in the street, and the government. It's a completely separate entity and part of the conflict, which does have sectarian overtones. But the original conflict itself is something that's fed by what I think is common to conflicts all across the world, regardless of the communities they're in, which they're founded on a lack of agency within the population between certain groups, huge environmental inequalities, and in the case of Syria at least, a huge impact of the environment, creating social situations where conflict became increasingly likely.
Final question.
Thank you. It's been really amazing hearing you all speak tonight. And my question is based off of Scott and Ambassador Rapp's discussion of, all three of you did this to some extent, but how important transitional justice and these justice mechanisms are, not only for any hope of positive peace within Syria, but also to set a precedent that the Hama solution, the Aleppo solution, cannot be what the international community accepts. However, even before the current context where a military solution does look like what we will see in Syria, the outcomes that looked possible there weren't many openings for real justice. Particularly, I think the most striking would be an example with immunity for the Assads if there was an overturn in power. And so how can negotiators and those working in peace deals, especially in a conflict that's as devastating as Syria's, how can they balance those concerns and
I realize this is a huge question. But what strategies can negotiators do to take in justice into account while trying to forge peace?
I mean, I'll just take the briefest stab at it, and this is a topic discussed very broadly, and we discussed it a little in San Francisco the other night. I mean, obviously we know in the negotiations that will soon, the next phase of negotiations in Syria, putting justice on the table is certainly what people in victimized groups want to see. It really seems essential if people are going to go home that those that committed these crimes against them aren't controlling their homes, et cetera. And so it's essential, and not having justice may make it impossible for some of the groups to agree. I mean, at the end of the day, too much blood has been spilled. Too many people have been martyred. You'd say stop, but they say no. We can't let these people die in vain. So justice in a sort of a fair way would actually maybe contribute, you would think, to it. On the other hand, it's so hard to imagine Assad or someone signing anything that would indicate that they were going to face consequences sometime. From my perspective, there needs to be at least the kind of promise of it, the prospect of it, a framework of it, sort of certain principles that have to be in there that some would sign, probably not really intending to honor them, and others would go along with, and then eventually one could perhaps use those to build sort of something in the future. One of the dynamics I think that's happened in the recent past, and particularly in civil wars where we've had a lot of failed negotiations which have resulted in power sharing, where basically thugs come together and agree to forgive each other the crimes they committed against the innocent, and pretty soon they've fallen out again and they're committing crimes against groups associated with each other. These don't get you real peace, and even in the Liberian context with as demonstrated, as shown in the film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, the activity that brought Lema Bowie the Nobel Prize, or share of it, it was let's get civil society involved. And so the pressure now in peace negotiations is let's get the civil society in there. When the civil society gets there, they say, we got to have justice. We have to have transitional justice. We have to have frameworks for it. And if you have, like in Colombia, an idea that you're going to have to go back to the public or to the political or to their representatives to get it approved, then you find that it's absolutely essential. You're not going to get agreement unless there's something in there for justice. Now, getting those that might be charged, it's painful, and you end up with a negotiation like you have in Colombia with alternative sentences, but still consequences. And even in South Sudan, where we've had total impunity, and not that this August of 2015 agreement is going to be enforced, but in order to get it signed, they had to provide a truth commission, a hybrid court, and a reparations authority. And so, and it wouldn't have been possible without it. And the AU we provided the U.S. $3 million to do that. So I actually think that having having justice in there, and at least ideas presented and insisting on them, is one of the ways that you bring aboard the most important actor, which is society itself. But then getting those that don't want the consequences to sign it is painful, and then requires those that are working and their allies to say, no, you've got to do this, and that's basically how we got it in the Sudan context.
Scott, could you just close our session by giving the audience some concrete ways to engage here if this is an issue that's important to them? Of course, number one would be supporting the Center for Justice and Accountability, so I'll say that one for you, but then what else? What else can we as ordinary Americans do?
Yeah, so of course CJA is a nonprofit, as there are many organizations that are working in this space. I think one of the things that can be done is to support civil society, because civil society groups around the world are stepping into this accountability gap and trying to fill it. And so that's sort of one immediate step that people can do. Another thing more locally, I think, is responding to the needs of refugees and trying to, whether it's calling your member of Congress or campaigning or donating to groups that are working on the refugee issue, reaching out. I mean, a phenomenon that's been arising is people hosting dinners with local Syrian refugees that have been resettled. as a way of not only simply making people feel welcome, but to also bridge that deep cultural gap and misunderstanding that really plagues us here in the United States. And I think that's one of the fundamental challenges, I think, for us to address this sort of level of xenophobia that sort of has informed fear, mistrust, misunderstanding that has informed the kind of anti-immigrant, particularly the anti-Islamic and anti-Syrian backlash that we're seeing, which is in some ways very distinct from what we've seen in earlier periods of, looking at the 1980s with waves of migrants and political refugees from Latin America, where you didn't necessarily have this discourse of Islamophobia or this fear of the sort of great unknown that is Syria. So I would encourage people to really study Syrian culture, eat Syrian food, listen to Syrian music. I mean, discover that this is an incredibly ancient civilization, or multiple civilizations. And I think the more we engage in it in a human way, in a sort of reaching across borders way, I don't mean to sound too touchy-feely, but there really is something to that, especially because the immensity of the immensity of the atrocities, the numbers, the raw statistics, sometimes it's overwhelming and it's almost dehumanizing. And I think to personalize it, to understand individual stories, to understand the lives of Syrians who, just like us, and some of the best and brightest, really, especially in the early period, educated professionals, really targeted for elimination because in many ways they pose the greatest threat to the regime. Trying to understand it on a human level and engage with it and to sensitize people around you and sensitize the U.S. government, members of Congress, I think that's an important step that we can all do.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists.